On a quiet Tuesday morning, Clearfield Trust Bank operated like any other day, transactions flowing, printers clicking, and polite nods exchanged between strangers. None of them knew that just minutes later, they would witness a moment that could change the way they saw those who once wore the uniform. An elderly man stepped through the door with a calm demeanor, holding a black cap embroidered with the words Vietnam Grenada Veteran in gold thread that had faded with time. He wasn't the kind of man who sought attention, nor one to boast about old war stories. He was simply there to withdraw some money from an old account he hadn't touched in nearly 3 decades. It wasn't a typical savings account. It held dollars that the government had once deposited as hazard pay, a small compensation for cold nights, unrecognized missions, and the youthful years he spent in distant lands so remote they didn't even dare put names on maps. His name was James Callahan, but his friends called him Jim. At 80 years old, his eyes were still sharp, though his hands had begun to tremble slightly, not from fear, but from time and the long campaigns spent in the jungles of Asia. Today, he only needed to withdraw a few $100s, not for himself, but to help his grandson pay the tuition for his first semester at community college. But what he didn't know was that, just moments later, his honor would be questioned. A doubtful glance from a young teller, a half smirk from a bank manager barely out of college, and then the questions casual on the surface, but sharp as blades underneath. Are you sure this account belongs to you? As if everything he had lived through was just some made-up tale. They didn't know, but they were about to. And that room would never be the same after that day. Jim Callahan stood at the teller window like anyone else. He didn't raise his voice. He wasn't angry. He didn't flash any medals to demand attention. Just a nearly 80-year-old man in a worn-out jacket, a tilted veteran's cap, and holding an old leather wallet that carried a few bills, a faded VA card, and 2 discharge papers typed on a machine from a bygone era. He handed over the documents with a lightly trembling hand, not from fear, but from decades of service in tropical heat and freezing cold that had taken a lasting toll. I just want to withdraw a little money for my grandson, he said softly. The account is under James Callahan. The teller, maybe 25 years old, glanced at the papers and then looked at him. Her eyes weren't unkind, but they were clearly unsure. She typed a few things into the system. The screen flashed something that made her frown. I'm going to call the manager, she said. Then Tyler arrived, the branch manager, slick back hair, crooked tie, and that irritating half smile. He took the discharge paper, gave a short laugh. This looks like it was printed during the Reagan era. He gave Jim a once-over, then added, louder this time so others could hear. You sure this account is yours, sir? The way he dragged out the word sir turned it from respect into a cruel joke. Jim said nothing. He quietly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a brass challenge coin, engraved with a symbol that only members of the Special Forces would ever receive. This wasn't something you could buy on eBay. It was a token of loyalty, of a lifelong vow of silence and duty. Tyler looked at the coin and shrugged. Looks cool, but you can get these online pretty easily nowadays. Then he turned to the security guard. I think we've got a case of fraud here. Let's escort this gentleman out. A few quiet chuckles came from behind. Someone raised their phone, as if waiting for a juicy viral video. One customer pretended to be busy with their own screen, while another turned their back to avoid getting involved. Jim didn't say a word. He picked up the coin, gently slipped it back into his pocket, and slowly turned away, walking step by step toward a bench near the window. He didn't argue. He didn't apologize. He didn't defend himself. He just sat back straight, eyes staring far away, like a man too familiar with cold rooms and colder stares. No one knew who they had just insulted. No one realized they had just cast out a living emblem of honor and sacrifice from the very place that stood because of men like him. But they were about to find out. And the silence in that bank was about to shift from indifference to shame. The atmosphere inside Clearfield Trust Bank gradually shifted to an uncomfortable kind of silence, not the solemn type, but the uneasy hush that hangs between judgment and doubt. Jim Callahan still sat there on the wooden bench near the window, back straight, hands resting on the handle of a worn oak cane. He didn't look at anyone. He didn't react. He just sat there like part of the wall, and yet his presence demanded the attention of the entire room. Whispers began to spread. A middle-aged woman in sunglasses leaned toward her husband and murmured, "These days, you never know who's real." A young man in a baseball cap smirked. "If he's really a vet, why is he dressed like he's homeless?" Someone else shrugged. "Seen a lot of fake vets online. They rake in donations all the time." The comments weren't loud enough to be called insults, but just quiet enough to seep like poison. A subtle, invisible prejudice wrapped in the phrase, "It's easy to fake it these days." No one wanted to confront him, but no one wanted to be close to the problem either. And in this room, the problem was a man who had once fought for them. But just as that tension threatened to burst, someone stepped forward. Her name was Tracy Nguyen, early 30s, hair tied neatly back, wearing a checkered shirt and dark jeans. She had been standing near the ATM, quietly observing the entire scene, until her eyes landed on the brass coin Jim had placed on the counter. She recognized it instantly, not because it was beautiful, but because she had seen it once before during a strategy briefing in her Navy days. A commanding officer had placed that same coin on the table, and the entire room stood up. She hadn't understood why then, but today, she did. Tracy walked straight to the counter, eyes locked on manager Tyler. "You just made a serious mistake," she said, her voice low but sharp as a blade. Tyler frowned. "Excuse me?" Tracy pointed toward the bench. "That man is not an imposter, and that coin you mocked is worth more than everything in your vault. Tu le snail. If he's so important, why isn't anyone with him?" Tracy didn't answer. Instead, she turned away, pulled out her phone, and dialed a number, an old contact at Western Command HQ. She said only 4 words. "Bishop Coyne, Jim Callahan." The line went silent. Then came a sharp reply. "You're telling me he's there? Don't let him leave." And at that same moment upstairs, a longtime bank employee named Raymond, just months from retirement, happened to overhear the name Jim Callahan. He froze, then stepped into a side hallway where a dust-covered brass plaque still hung honoring officers who had once served on the very grounds where the bank now stood, back when it was a military base. There, clear beneath years of grime, were the words, "Lieutenant Colonel James M. Callahan, Strategic Oversight, Clearfield Operations Base." Raymond said nothing. He simply returned to his desk, picked up a phone, dialed a special number, and spoke 6 steady words. "Bishop Coyne, Clearfield Trust, he's here." The phone on the heavy mahogany desk at Western Regional Command rang just as a high-level strategy meeting reached its critical point. Lieutenant General Marcus Ellison, a decorated 3-star commander with nearly 4 decades of military service, was reviewing a classified intelligence report. He rarely allowed interruptions, but when his aide stepped in and whispered, "It's a call regarding Bishop Coyne. Name, Jim Callahan." His hand stopped mid-motion. He didn't ask a single question. Didn't hesitate. He rose, buttoned his dress uniform right there in the room, and told his deputy just 3 words. "Suit up, we're leaving." No one in that room questioned it, because the name Jim Callahan wasn't ordinary. It was a name passed quietly through secure briefings, tied to operations that would never appear in history books. A man, General Ellison himself, had once studied during Special Response Officer training, the very architect of the original tactical principles still used in modern-day U.S. Joint Force operations. A black SUV pulled out of the base. No sirens, no fuss. Just a single flashing light enough to make traffic part. The drive took only 10 minutes, but to General Ellison, it was 10 minutes of containing a fury, not just his own, but on behalf of an entire generation of warriors, those who had bled and sacrificed for freedom, and were now being questioned because of faded documents, worn clothing, and a society that had forgotten how to recognize a true hero. When the doors of Clearfield Trust Bank swung open with force, no one in the lobby had time to react. The sharp stomp of military boots on tile echoed like a ceremonial drumbeat. Lieutenant General Ellison entered with a presence that froze the entire room. Back straight like steel, each metal on his chest catching the pale fluorescent light overhead. He didn't look around, didn't ask questions. He walked straight to the bench where Jim Callahan sat. And then, before the stunned eyes of everyone present, he raised his hand in a sharp, formal military salute, not to a man, but to a legacy. Jim looked up, surprised for a moment, then slowly stood and returned the salute, with the same precision and weight it had carried since the first day he wore the uniform. No one in that bank knew exactly what was happening, but everyone felt it. The man they had doubted was someone the entire military revered. Silence gave way to awe and shame. Not a single soul dared breathe too loudly. When General Marcus Ellison turned to face the room, the lobby felt frozen in place. But his voice didn't rise in anger. He didn't shout. He spoke truth. His tone low, sharp as steel, and heavy as judgment. Who here called Colonel James Callahan a fraud? The question rang out clear, cold enough to freeze the sweat on Manager Tyler's brow. No one answered. All eyes fell in one direction. But no one dared admit the disrespect they had taken part in. The general stepped forward, gaze locked onto Tyler. Colonel Callahan, he said, emphasizing each word, is the man who laid the foundation for our coordinated rapid response strategies. His military record spans 2 wars, 4 unacknowledged operations, and dozens of missions where only a few lived to tell the story. Then he opened the black leather case his aide had brought along. Inside was a red stamp file marked classified, containing a copy of the brass plaque hanging upstairs, the one with the name Lieutenant Colonel James M. Callahan, listed as strategic commander of the Clearfield military base before the land was ever turned into a civilian district. He placed the file squarely on the counter, right in front of Tyler, his tone now quieter but no less firm. The account you questioned today was once used to fund wartime logistics, and this bank, the one you're standing in, exists because of the strategy of the very man you just dismissed. All eyes turned to Jim Callahan. He stood silently beside General Ellison, not demanding justice, not asking for compensation, not needing an apology. He hadn't come for recognition. He'd come to withdraw a few $100s to help his grandson pay for college. General Ellison gave a single nod, then turned to the bank staff and said, "We're going to ensure he gets exactly what he came for, and he won't wait another second." Tyler, the same man who had laughed at that old discharge paper, backed away like a shadow, his gaze now lowered, his mouth too ashamed to form a single word. The silence lingered, but it was no longer one of suspicion. It had become something else: respect, awareness, and above all, a lesson no one in that room would ever forget. That honor, when restored the right way, can change not only a space, but the very hearts of those who once took it for granted. When the transaction was finally complete, Jim Callahan simply nodded in quiet thanks. There were no handshakes, no cameras waiting. No one stood to deliver a speech. He took the withdrawal receipt, folded it neatly, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, as if it were just another task in a long lifetime of silent duties. He hadn't come seeking the spotlight. He hadn't come to be praised or saluted. He came for one simple reason: to keep a promise to his grandson that he would cover the first semester's tuition, even if it was just a few $100s. But sometimes it is those very quiet acts that create moments a room falls silent to remember. As Jim turned to leave the counter, General Ellison placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Colonel, you've got 5 more minutes." Jim raised an eyebrow. 5 minutes for what? Ellison gestured toward the banking hall. "For the honor you never asked for." And then something remarkable happened. No command was given. No announcement made. A young reservist near the ATM suddenly straightened his posture, turned, and raised his hand in salute. A Navy veteran filling out a form stood up and did the same. One by one, person after person in that lobby, even those who had never worn a uniform, felt the weight of the moment. No one told them to stand. They just knew they had to. Jim stood still, not smug, not surprised. He simply returned the salute with the same precise motion he had learned at boot camp more than 50 years ago. Then General Ellison reached into his chest pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a quiet metal. Nothing flashy. No ceremony, no spotlight, just 3 engraved words: "Service beyond record." Jim stared at it for a long moment. He didn't speak. He didn't cry. He simply nodded slowly, as if closing a chapter no one had read, but one he had cherished line by line. When Jim Callahan stepped out of Clearfield Trust Bank, the sun was already high, casting a soft light across the tiled floor. He didn't look back. He didn't need to know who was watching. He didn't need to know whether anyone fully understood what had just happened. To him, the day wasn't a victory, and it wasn't a declaration. It was simply a promise kept to a grandson and maybe to a part of himself long buried under years of silence. There were no cameras waiting at the door, no reporters, no headlines in the morning paper. But inside that bank, something had changed. People spoke more softly. They stood a little closer, and some glanced toward the bench where Jim had once sat, now empty, but somehow heavier than before. A few days later, a small plaque was added beneath the old honor board that had hung upstairs for decades. It wasn't large. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't adorned in gold. Just a single line etched into aged brass. James M. Callahan, Colonel, U.S. Army, honor and silence. No further explanation was needed. No retelling required. Because some truths, when proven through dignity and silence, can reach deeper than any words ever could. The story of Colonel James Callahan isn't about medals or battlefield glory. It's a quiet reminder that honor never fades with time, and that the silence of a soldier can echo louder than 1,000 rounds of applause. In a world that rushes to judge people by appearances or outdated paperwork, we often forget that some of the most powerful values aren't printed in bold. They live in quiet actions and promises kept without fanfare. He didn't seek recognition, but it was his humility that moved the entire room to rise. Not out of command, but because their hearts knew they were in the presence of someone who truly deserved it. In life, never be too quick to judge someone by a first glance, because behind an old coat or a slow step may lie a lifetime of sacrifice, loyalty, and service, never once asking for anything in return. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment below, share your thoughts, or simply write a message of thanks to those who've served. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss more human, powerful, and inspiring stories like this one. Because sometimes, just one story is enough to help us slow down, feel deeper, and appreciate more.